Welcome to the first of what I hope will be a long series of video essays, mostly talking about politics, but don't be surprised if from time to time I end up talking about Doctor Who, because sometimes I just can't help myself. But today, at least, I want to talk about democracy and its downgrading by design. Like me, you've probably been hearing a lot lately about people losing faith in democracy as a system of government, gravitating instead towards more illiberal or authoritarian models of social organisation. And if we look around, yes, it does depressingly seem to be the case. But it's no accident that we are where we find ourselves. Of course, democracy isn't delivering, because the thing that we call democracy isn't democracy. The closest that we get to the ideal form of modern democracy, as some have experienced it, is the period immediately following the Second World War, at least across the UK and certain parts of Europe. In Britain, after the shared sacrifices and struggles of the war, there was a tacit agreement that things simply couldn't go back to the way they were before, where your class pretty much dictated how you lived your life. A welfare state was properly initiated. The National Health Service was formed, creations which spoke to an ideology of equality. Not perfect equality, of course, but a good step in the right direction. All born of the in-it-together philosophy forged by years of war. This in-it-togetherness bled into politics. After so many of the working classes had given their lives in the defence of Britain, there could be no going back to the dismissing of their calls for fairness and social justice in peacetime. Economics became more redistributive. Union voices were not just heard, but were seen as important, powerful, and an individual's vote truly felt like a say in the direction that the country was taking. Your political affiliation meant something. To put things another way, however, after the working classes fought for their country, the wealthy, who have always enjoyed having their hands on the levers of power, had suddenly to put up and shut up. It just wasn't the done thing to be seen hoarding all the profits while exploiting your workforce anymore. That kind of greed became bad form in the burgeoning one-nation politics of post-war Britain. From now on, everyone was to get a fair piece of the pie. But greed is a hard habit to break. It's an addiction, and a certain section of the wealthy simply weren't ready to give up their habit. Instead of embracing this new socio-economic egalitarianism, which would have also been very good for them had they been able to see beyond their own everything-for-me junky avarice, they quietly resented it. And over time, that resentment festered. Then came the 80s, and the return of the greed is good narrative, now posing as a new economic orthodoxy calling itself free market neoliberalism. Essentially, the same old rapacious grasping, just gussied up and given both a veneer of academic respectability by people like Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, and a whiff of cultural heft by a renewed interest in the works of Ayn Rand, particularly Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Suddenly, in a gross slap in the face to galactic history's greatest moral philosopher, Mr. Spock, the needs of the individual outweighed the needs of the many. Conveniently, or more accurately, willfully, forgetting that there is no individual without society. The entrepreneur was king. Profit was the ultimate goal of man. And yes, late 20th century capitalism was a total sausage fest. And anything that got in the way of that goal was to be crushed. Starting with unions and their troublesome demands for a fair wage that rewarded their labour, and then governments still beholden to the unwritten post-war contract between social classes that the benefits of industry were to be shared between all. Money began pouring into the pockets of politicians. A new parasitic species of lobbyists evolved around the corridors of power, and before we knew it, union power and collective bargaining became greatly diminished. Labour laws shifted in favour of the factory owners, with no redress for the workforce, Employment rights became precarious. Companies were run purely for the benefit of shareholders, even if those companies were supplying a public good. And in some places, personhood was even bestowed upon these companies. Privatization, the greatest scam the corporate world has ever played on society, became the watchword of successive Western governments. And with all that money from wealthy donors flowing towards our elected representatives began to forget who they were elected to represent, and instead started focusing on what their billionaire paymasters wanted, thereby decimating the value of the democratic vote, which now only served to choose what colour tie would be worn by those administering the wishes of the wealthy corporate elite. This is the situation that has been engineered over the last 40 years. Big money has removed all sense or meaning of democracy from democracy, so that it can finally get rid of it altogether and in its place embed oligarchic autocracy. If you doubt that, ask yourself this: who is it behind all of these far-right movements whose politics of national sovereignty and ethnic conformity are always weirdly accompanied by anti-environment, pro-fossil fuel, anti-union, pro-shareholder rights, anti-social welfare, pro-corporate welfare, and a whole host of other policies that unfailingly favour the rights and entitlements of the already filthy rich over the destined to be forever poor? The answer, in case any of you doubted it, is billionaires. The most obvious example, of course, is Donald Trump, who decided to stop paying presidents to do his bidding and become one instead, happily using his office to take bribes from the willing and extort from the unwilling. But beyond the obvious, you have the more insidious types. Take Elon Musk, for example. Now, just like him, you don't have to be a genius to work out what drives ketamine Ken, or at least what solely used to drive him, before he fell down the insane, radical rabbit hole that he actually built for himself out of copious drug use and constant deranged engagement with his own social media platform, the right-wing cesspool X. Before he radicalized himself into believing a whole bunch of weird conspiracy nonsense, Musk was already all about dismantling governments. Why? Because despite the best efforts of many, at the time the world seemed to be moving in a more progressive direction, and eventually, as far as economics go, that progressivism would have to translate into fair taxation. In short, the world would have to move back to that post-war period of redistributive egalitarianism, meaning no more hoarding. So imagine, instead of paying tax, instead of paying his staff decent wages, instead of making sure his employees are happy, that they enjoy the kinds of rights that promote security and dignity, and still being disgustingly wealthy, Elon Musk would rather burn society to the ground. Just think about that. Ketamine Ken appeared over a live video link to address a crowd of racists at a far-right Unite the Kingdom rally in London on September the 13th, 2025, calling for a dissolution of Parliament, claiming massive uncontrolled immigration was destroying Britain, and warning an already unhinged mob that violence was coming. All because he doesn't want to pay tax. That's all it ever boils down to. Whether it's Musk or the Koch family, or Larry and David Ellison, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Patrick Soon-Shiong, Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, Rupert or Lachlan Murdoch, or any number of the Trumps, their influence and control comes down to one simple base desire: to hog it all. It doesn't matter how much everybody else suffers, as long as they get to own it all. It doesn't matter that kids go hungry. It doesn't matter if illness or age bankrupts you. It doesn't matter if your pension is worthless. It doesn't matter that roads and schools fall apart. It doesn't matter that minorities are vilified and terrorized. It doesn't matter if women are not permitted autonomy over their own bodies. It doesn't matter if religious zealots impose their unlivable beliefs on a population that doesn't want them. It doesn't matter that people have no control over their rents or can be made homeless on the whim of a bank. It doesn't matter if we are taxed until we have barely enough left to scrape even half a meal together. None of that matters if billionaires get to add another penny, another cent to their already heaving fortunes. Fortunes they can do nothing with except pass on to their heirs in order to keep the cycle of misery going on for another generation. And for a few brief, precious decades, the obstacle to that pernicious, destructive avarice was a democracy that meant something. A democracy that society as a whole could invest in, could believe in. A democracy that, while far from perfect, seemed to be trying to work for everyone, at least as far as class went. Gender and ethnicity was still a long way off. But by and large, people were on the whole content, except for a tiny minority of billionaires. A minority whose wealth was already so large they were anyway shielded from the trials and privations of the daily grind, and always would be, but for whom more than enough would never be enough. So, rather than share the wealth that remained, the billionaire class destroyed democracy. First by stealth, and then blatantly, brazenly, openly buying made-to-measure policy for all to see, ensuring the loss of faith that has led us to where we are today, seemingly on the brink of Western-wide authoritarianism, with trust in politics at an all-time low, and wannabe fascists, nationalist populists, and ultra-right evangelical zealots swimming about the fins of billionaire sharks like pilot fish or blood-sucking lampreys. What then are we to do? How do we restore faith in democracy? For a start, we can remind people what real democracy looked like, what actual representation looked like, what it meant when your vote had weight and significance. We show them that they are right to feel disillusioned with the democracy that they are currently being served. We can agree that it is a poor, diminished excuse for a system. But then we show how it has been made that way, by a massively wealthy elite, who want us to turn our backs on democracy, and as a consequence, any means to exercise accountability. And then to question the motivations behind why an individual would want that. I don't think anyone would be too surprised by the answers. Nobody became a billionaire through altruism. In the end, the mission is not to turn away from democracy, especially when we're being so heavily encouraged to do so, and by who is doing the encouraging. The mission, in fact, is to reclaim democracy. Democracy is the power of the people. Beware the agenda of those claiming anything else, because once you have ceded that power, it is very difficult to get it back. There is still time to change course, to reject the manipulation and sound the trumpet for true representational democracy while we still can, while the mechanisms are still in place. Democracy can work. The power of the vote is better than the powerlessness of none. Democracy only really dies when you believe them when they tell you that it's dead.